Welcome to the deep dive. Think about this for a second. The trillions of tiny bacteria living in your gut and your mental state, specifically something as complex as schizophrenia. How could they possibly be connected?
It really does sound a bit like science fiction, doesn't it? But there's this growing field looking at the gut-brain axis.
The gut-brain axis.
Yeah, basically the biochemical signals flying back and forth between your digestive system and your brain. It's fascinating stuff.
And for this deep dive, we're zeroing in on one particular study that looks right at this connection, specifically differences in the gut microbiome of people with chronic schizophrenia.
That's the one. Our source is a paper from Schizophrenia Research. The title gives it away. Differences in gut microbiome composition between persons with chronic schizophrenia and healthy comparison subjects.
Okay, let's unpack this. The goal here is to really dig into this research, how they did it, what
Right.
they actually found about the gut bacteria differences between these groups, and, well, what it might all mean.
Right. And the authors mention up front that while there's a lot of buzz around the gut-brain axis and mental health, there wasn't much specifically on chronic schizophrenia, especially in the U.S. and including folks with other common health issues.
So this study aimed to fill a gap.
Exactly. Provide some needed data points.
So how did they set it up? Who took part in the study?
They had 50 adults altogether. 25 had a diagnosis of chronic schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder,
Okay.
and the other 25 were healthy comparison subjects matched demographically with no history of psychiatric illness. Ages range from 30 up to 76.
And you mentioned matching it. They put effort into making the groups similar, right? Why was that so critical?
Oh, absolutely crucial. Your gut microbiome is affected by so many things: age, sex, race, what you eat, medications, BMI, recent antibiotics, you name it.
Loads of variables.
Exactly. So to try to see if differences were linked to schizophrenia itself, they matched the groups carefully on those factors: age, sex, race, BMI category, recent antibiotic use.
So you can be more confident the differences aren't just because one group was older or something like that.
Precisely. It helps isolate the variable of interest, which here is schizophrenia.
Got it. Okay, so they have these matched groups. How did they actually, look inside the gut? How did they measure the bacteria?
They collected stool samples. That gives you a snapshot of the gut bacteria composition.
Right.
Then they used a lab technique called 16S RNA sequencing. It's a way to identify bacteria based on a specific gene they all have.
Okay.
It lets you figure out which types of bacteria are in the sample and roughly how much of each type there is, relatively speaking. Plus, they gathered a lot of clinical info from the schizophrenia group: symptoms, how long they've been ill, medications, etc.
All right, samples collected, sequencing done. What were the big findings? What did the data show about these gut communities?
Well, the first major result was about the overall community composition. They measure this using something called beta diversity.
Okay, beta diversity. Break that down for us simply.
Think of it like comparing two different cities. Beta diversity isn't just about counting the number of different types of people in each city. It's about how different the overall mix of people is between the two cities.
So comparing the whole bacterial neighborhood in the schizophrenia group versus the healthy group.
Exactly. How different is the overall structure? And the study found a significant difference here.
A clear difference between the groups.
Yes, very significant. The overall gut microbiome composition was distinctly different. When they plotted the data visually, the two groups formed separate clusters. They didn't overlap. That's a strong signal.
And there was something surprising about how those clusters looked, wasn't there?
There was. This is quite interesting. The healthy comparison group's microbiomes were actually more similar to each other. Their data points clustered more tightly together, whereas the microbiomes within the schizophrenia group were more spread out, more variable from person to person within that group.
That is unexpected. You might assume an illness would create a more uniform pattern, but here there's more internal variation among those with schizophrenia. What about the diversity within a single person's sample? Was that different?
Ah, right. That's measured by alpha diversity.
Alpha diversity.
Yeah, think of that like looking at just one city and counting how many different types of people live there and how evenly spread out they are. In the gut, it's the number and evenness of different bacterial types within one person's sample.
Okay, and what did they find for alpha diversity?
This was another surprise. They found no significant difference in alpha diversity between the two groups.
Really? So it wasn't that people with schizophrenia had, say, fewer types of bacteria overall.
Apparently not, according to this measure. The difference wasn't in the sheer number of different types or their evenness. It was more about which specific types were present and in what relative amounts. The community structure was different, but not necessarily the overall richness.
Okay, so the overall pattern is different, but not the basic level of variety. That leads to the next question. Which specific bacteria were different?
Right, getting into the details, they looked at different taxonomic levels. At a high level, the phylum level, they found that proteobacteria were relatively decreased in the schizophrenia group compared to the healthy controls.
Proteobacteria down. Okay, and more specifically at the genus level.
At the genus level, they found a few key differences. Anaerococcus was relatively increased in the schizophrenia group.
Increased.
Yeah. And conversely, Haemophilus, Sutterella, and Clostridium were relatively decreased.
Decreased. Interesting mix of ups and downs.
Definitely. And they also noted many differences at an even finer level, what they call SOTUs, sort of like specific strains, especially within a large group called Clostridales, which are very common gut bacteria.
Now, the really fascinating part is trying to connect these bacterial differences back to the people themselves. Did the study look for links between specific bacteria and symptoms or maybe other health issues within that schizophrenia group?
Yes, they did. And this is where you start to see potential clinical relevance, maybe. They looked for correlations.
And what correlations popped up?
Some really interesting ones. For instance, a greater abundance of bacteria from the Ruminocaceae family was correlated with lower severity of negative symptoms.
Negative symptoms, like lack of motivation, flat effect.
Exactly. So in this group, having more of these Ruminocaceae bacteria seemed to be associated with fewer of those negative symptoms.
Huh. That sounds almost like a potentially positive link.
The correlation points that way, yes. It's intriguing. But then on the other side, a greater abundance of Bacteroides was correlated with worse depressive symptoms within the schizophrenia group.
Okay, so a different bacteria linked to a different symptom cluster. What about physical health? We know people with schizophrenia often face higher risks.
Good point. They looked at that too. They found that higher levels of the genus Carpococcus were associated with a greater estimated 10-year risk for coronary heart disease, based on the Framingham risk score calculation.
Wow. So a potential microbial link to cardiovascular risk.
It's an association they observed, yeah. They also found a link with the age of illness onset. It was positively correlated with cyanobacteria abundance, meaning lower levels of cyanobacteria were associated with an earlier age of onset.
Were there things they looked for but didn't find a link?
Yes, and this is important too. They didn't find significant links between specific bacterial abundances and either how long someone had been ill or their daily dose of antipsychotic medication.
That's notable given how central medication is.
It is. Suggests the medication dose, at least in this study, wasn't the main driver of the specific bacterial differences they measured.
Now, what about other factors? The paper mentions things like smoking, other medical conditions. These are common in schizophrenia and known to affect the gut. How did they tackle those confounders?
Right. That's crucial for interpretation. Smoking, for example. More people smoked in the schizophrenia group, and smoking definitely impacts the microbiome.
So could smoking explain the main difference?
Well, they checked that. They compared smokers versus non-smokers just within the schizophrenia group, and they found no significant overall microbiome difference between those subgroups.
Ah, okay.
It suggests that while smoking likely plays a role, it probably wasn't the sole reason for the big difference they saw between the main schizophrenia group and the healthy group in this study. Although they did find that within the schizophrenia group, smoking for more years was linked to higher levels of actinobacteria.
Interesting nuance. And what about other medical conditions like diabetes or hypertension?
Similar story. Those conditions were more common in the schizophrenia group, as expected. But when they compared participants within the schizophrenia group who had these conditions versus those who didn't, there wasn't a significant difference in their overall microbiome composition caused by those conditions alone.
So again, while those conditions are present and important, they didn't seem to be the main driver of the overall gut difference between the schizophrenia and healthy groups.
That's how the researchers interpreted it based on their analysis, yes. It strengthens the case that the observed microbiome difference is more closely linked to the schizophrenia status itself, or factors intrinsically tied to it.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together. What's the core message the authors want us to take away?
The main conclusion is pretty clear. This study provides solid evidence that the gut microbiome composition is, in fact, altered in people with chronic schizophrenia, at least in this U.S.-based sample.
And how does this finding stack up against other research that's been done?
They mention it's consistent with some previous studies, the general idea of an altered microbiome. But those studies were often in different populations, maybe different countries, or looked at earlier stages like first episode psychosis.
And the specific bacteria might vary.
Exactly. The specific bacteria identified as different can vary quite a bit between studies, which just highlights how complex this is. Differences could be due to geography, diet, genetics, study methods, lots of factors.
And the big caveat here, cause and effect.
Absolutely critical, and they stress this. This is a cross-sectional study, a snapshot in time. It shows these differences exist together.
But it can't tell us if schizophrenia causes the gut changes or if the gut changes contribute to schizophrenia.
Precisely. That question remains unanswered by this type of study design. Chicken or egg?
What did they see as the main limitations of their own work?
Well, the sample size, while decent, is still relatively small, 50 people total. That limits how much you can generalize. And as we just said, the inability to determine causality is a major limitation inherent in the design.
Makes sense. But what about the strengths? What did they do well?
The careful matching of participants is a big strength. It helps control for those confounding factors we talked about.
Right.
Also focusing on a chronic U.S. population, and importantly, including people with common co-occurring medical conditions, makes the findings potentially more relevant to the real clinical picture of chronic schizophrenia.
So where does this leave us? What's the next step?
They see this as laying groundwork. It really points to the need for larger studies, and especially longitudinal studies following people over time.
To see how things change.
Exactly. To track the microbiome over the course of the illness, see how it relates to changes in symptoms, diet, lifestyle, cognition, and maybe, just maybe, start to unravel that cause and effect puzzle.
So still lots of questions, but what's the potential payoff down the road? Why should we, the listeners, care about these gut bacteria differences?
Well, the potential, and it's still potential at this stage, is pretty exciting. If we can really understand these links between specific bacteria and specific symptoms or health risks, it might eventually help. Maybe in predicting outcomes or assessing risk for things like heart disease more accurately in this population. And maybe further down the line, it could even open doors to new types of interventions.
Like what?
Things like probiotics, prebiotics, maybe even fecal transplants, ways to modulate the gut microbiome. Not as a cure for schizophrenia, definitely not, but perhaps as supportive strategies.
To improve overall well-being, or maybe help with specific symptoms or those associated health risks.
That's the hope. Using the gut as another avenue to potentially support health in people living with schizophrenia.
It's a remarkable idea, isn't it, that this ecosystem inside us, so seemingly distant from the brain, could be tied into something as profound as schizophrenia and related health outcomes.
It truly underscores how interconnected everything in the body is. We're really just scratching the surface of understanding these connections.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, just consider that complexity. Mental health is incredibly intricate, and now we're seeing how this microscopic world in our gut might be part of the picture. It really makes you wonder, how might this growing knowledge of the gut-brain axis change how we approach support, treatment, and overall health for people with conditions like schizophrenia in the years to come? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the gut microbiome and schizophrenia.